Hi, I'm Jesse Dillon, and this is my co-host,
Priscilla Cohen, and this is Jesse's office.
Today we're talking to renowned art dealer and curator Jeffrey Deitch. We're asking, what is art? We also talk about working with artists like
Andy Warhol, Basquiat, Keith Haring, and Kaws, and a changing of the guard of the art world. But first, please subscribe to our YouTube channel to watch this and more episodes, or
subscribe to Jesse's office wherever you stream your podcasts. Feel free to leave comments and reviews. We try to respond whenever we can.
hello. Hi. It's a different situation happening. Good to see you again. Right? Yeah, well, the aesthete that your art tells us is good.
I love the pattern of bricks.
Well, you can stare at the bricks.
Claire was saying you might want to shoot some stuff from the other thing again. Of course we can do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? But we
Sure.
could look at it and decide.
See, you astonished me with this first question, what is art? Which is like the ultimate question.
Right. What
What
do
is
you
it?
think? What is art? Have you thought about it more?
Yes, I have.
What do you think it is?
Well, the wonderful thing about art is that artists can redefine art in what they do.
Right.
So what people assumed art was last year can be different in the coming year.
Right.
And so it's one of the few fields
Yeah.
where the participants and the viewers continually redefine it.
When you look at, I don't know, have you looked at any of those cave paintings from 25,000 years ago?
Extraordinary. Somebody showed me, so I had a fascinating conversation with a beekeeper
Right.
last week.
Right.
He's married to the artist Kiki Smith,
Right.
whom I did an exhibition. And he was telling me about the first cave painting, supposedly the first cave painting,
Right.
which represents a bee shaman. And I looked this up on the internet. I couldn't believe it.
Right.
It could have been done today.
Right.
And says a lot about the human spirit, human nature, where this cave painting, which possibly is the earliest cave painting ever found,
Right.
if you blew that up and traced it out on the wall of my gallery,
Right.
people would say, that's great.
Right.
Who is this young artist?
Right.
What makes it great? You say that's great.
Oh, okay. So there's something that I've learned about the power of art. And it's a two-dimensional medium of painting. So sculpture is different. But there's something where an image converges. And there's often in the strongest images, there's a kind of symmetry.
Right.
And this particular image has the symmetry, it has the resonance of a power of an actual person. There's something that we can talk about with figurative art, where the best artists can somehow represent the power, personality of an actual person, of themselves, and transfer that magic that you get in speaking with a charismatic person into a representational image on a wall or on a canvas.
When you see that, we know, we don't know who the artist was. We don't even know what life was like around that cave. We have no idea why he painted or she painted that picture. I mean, do you ever think of, like in that case of a cave painting, do you ever wonder why it was painted or how or what went on around it and how it relates to your gallery? Or is your gallery just, paintings and shadows on a wall?
Well, it's very interesting to think of the connection between artist and shaman.
Yeah.
Okay,
Right.
so this image from the cave, it's referred to as the bee shaman. And something also very interesting, there are mushrooms in the hands. So may have been a figure who was on a kind of LSD trip.
That's good to think about.
Thousands and thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
In terms of the artist and the shaman, a number of artists really play that up in their persona.
Right.
There, in a lot of the best art, there is this mystical power, something unexplained. And what I love is when I see an artist working on a painting and I follow it, and then the last few brushstrokes, there's a magic that occurs. How did they do that? How did they animate this inanimate image?
You know, you work with some of the greatest artists of the time, so when you're looking at those artists, I mean, even though you've started with them quite early, at this point, a lot of them are very fully formed, so they know that the painting is going to be good. I'm forgetting-
Basquiat?
Well, Basquiat a long time ago, but more recently, just I forget which artist it was who sold painting.
Well,
Jeff Koons?
Yeah, Jeff
That was-
Koons. It's like, Jeff Koons, I don't know Jeff Koons, but when he goes to do a project, he's pretty sure it's going to be good and you're going to be blown away. I mean, do you find that experience different than outsider art, where it's like the artist maybe doesn't know it's good or isn't as confident and what's the difference between these two ideas?
Well, the difference between outsider and insider, this is a fascinating subject in art. And sometimes the outsider artist is someone who just didn't go through the Yale University MFA program or CalArts. They just followed a different path.
Right.
And didn't spend their 20s chatting up art critics and dealers in New York City.
Right.
They're just in a different place. But kind of the practice, the experience that they put into it has all the hallmarks of what a great artist does. But there are also outsider artists who may be in a different realm. There are people who might have developmental disabilities. They have the ability to have very powerful direct expression. So that's quite different.
Do you have, I forget the name of the artist who did the butterflies and sort of did
Damien Hirst?
No, young outsider artist, who died. Nobody'd ever seen any of his work, and that was all in these books.
You mean David? Was his name David? The guy that lived on the grounds? Who's the one that lived on a...
Well, they each have their own stories.
Yeah.
The point is that a lot of them are making art just for the sake of making art. Have you had the experience of being surprised and seeing a body of work where you just go, my God, I can't believe all this stuff happened?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. So there was a fantastic artist who, his name was Willie Cole, and he was someone who hung around Fashion Moda, this very influential art space in the South Bronx in the early 80s. And what he did is he carved pieces of wood.
Right.
And into animal legs, and he put marbles in them. And this was the time when we were discovering the inventors of wild style graffiti.
Right.
Lee Quinones, Crash. But I was equally fascinated by this guy. It turned out he supported himself as a messenger for Western Union.
Right.
And he didn't have the opportunities to go to art school, but somehow he found his way to Fashion Moda.
Right.
He unfortunately died young, so the career didn't continue, but I still have a work of his that's so resonant.
Right.
He's one of the best artists I ever encountered.
Is there a thing with an outsider artist, or maybe you can't generalize, where it's just an obsession to create and they're not really connecting to the idea of being known, being famous, getting money? It's more need to express? Is there any?
Well, I think these needs you're talking about, the needs to express, that's characteristic of the best artists who are in the system, who earn money, who are professional. So I have met a few people who enter this as a kind of business. But almost every top artist I know, the business and career rewards are just it's not the primary motivation at all. You know, they are there to make art. Also, I know a number of top artists who deliberately make the business part difficult by creating problems with their art dealers, with collectors. You know, there are others who behave perfectly in the system. They're also excellent artists. Depends on the personality.
Do they have to? Is there a kind of the cliche that you have to be tortured to do art? Can you be a happy person? Do you any of your patrons?
It's artists are just there's so many personalities that go into being a successful artist, musician, writer, and so I'm friendly with great artists who are so well-rounded as people.
Right.
That they're family people, they're perfect at raising children, at taking care of their partners, their parents, always polite, and they're also radical artists.
Yeah.
Okay, and we all know artists who are incomplete as people.
Yeah.
Who are really holy terrors. So it's not something contrary to the popular myth that the best artists are crazy.
Yeah.
I too know some great artists who are crazy.
Yeah.
But I know just as many who are totally sane and absolutely pleasurable, pleasure to get to know.
When you see somebody stumping around in their attic actually, and they find a Caravaggio up there, what does that make you? And Caravaggio was a tortured artist, and obviously this was a very important seminal painting that they found, and they know that because there were copies of it made, but it disappears just hanging around in this attic. Like, I mean, where does your mind go when you see something like that?
I just read that story on this as well.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating. Caravaggio was renowned during his lifetime. Shortly after he died, there was actually a biography written about Caravaggio.
Right.
But then I wasn't aware of this until I read that story, that for hundreds of years, he sort of dropped out of the mainstream art history.
Yeah.
And so it seems implausible, but I guess that's what happened, that even a masterwork of Caravaggio would sort of get lost, that it wasn't as valued as it was during his lifetime, and certainly as it is now.
You see these happen, French Revolution, like 50 paintings go missing out of the Louvre. One of them is the other Mona Lisa, and then it shows back up. And it seems like there's very little of this stuff out there, this really great stuff. Is that it? And then you think about the modern era, and there's more of it. But, a lot of times I wonder, like, oh, will they make these things? I just was looking at your Future of Sculpture, and I'm looking at all these materials they're making with, I'm not an artist, but I'm going, well, geez, how long can that last? Can it be physically, is it impermanent and going to fall apart? Some of those things looked like they are. And how do you think about that? Because you're sort of guiding collectors and you have to have your eye on history. How do you think about it?
Okay, this is a fascinating topic. So one of the exhibitions that I curated was called Posthuman, and we presented it in a wonderful space, the Deitch in Hamburg. And they're very professional, and they engaged the leading art conservator in Hamburg to unpack and do condition reports on every work of art as it came in.
Right.
His name was Christian Scheidemann. He was a specialist on old master painting. And Christian became so fascinated by the new materials that these artists were using. For instance, the Matthew Barney piece that was included in the show, an important component of it was made with tapioca.
Right.
And Robert Gober contributed works that were somehow solidified donuts with some resin on them. And
All donuts
so,
have
so,
that.
so Christian got so interested in this, he began working with the artists, helping them, and he eventually moved to New York City and became the world specialist on these new materials,
Right.
some not so new, that artists were incorporating into their work. And he, some years later, conserved the tapioca
Yeah.
in the Matthew Barney sculpture. So the point of this is that there is now a very distinguished specialist
Right.
in how to preserve these unusual, contrary artist materials. So if an artist like Robert Gober, Matthew Barney, is important in art history, there will be specialist conservators
Right.
who will be there as well to take care of these fragile works.
Now, do you have in your collection things that have liquid in them, and you're always worried about them?
I
'Cause
do. I do.
So, how
So,
do you,
so, for instance, one of the most problematic works in my collection in terms of preservation was a great work by Janine Antoni. 7 busts of herself made out of soap and 7 made out of chocolate.
right?
So the soap busts she would take into the bathtub with her and caress,
Right.
and
Right.
just like a bar of soap. It's where the image changes, it softens, and then the chocolate busts she would lick, she would bite, she would sculpt them by munching on them, licking
Right.
them. So, obviously, these are a great challenge to preserve.
Now,
Where
what's
are
that,
they now?
What's that conversation like when she first shows it to you? And like, you're looking at like, well, wait a minute, what are you thinking when you're looking at that?
Well, it's such a powerful work because of her own engagement with it,
Right.
with
Yeah.
her body.
Yeah.
It's so sensual. So at first, you don't even think of these issues of, hey, what's going to happen to this?
Yeah.
I began worrying about this when another work in soap and chocolate was
No, are you
taken-
cornering the market
Yeah,
on
wait a
soap
minute.
and
Is there another
chocolate?
artist doing soap and chocolate?
Well, she did some smaller editions. This is sort of the real thing with the 14 busts. But there was another work, similar materials, that the greatest collector of his day, Charles Saatchi, had. And
Right.
when the art handlers went to retrieve it from his warehouse, it was found that rats had gotten in and had eaten quite a bit of the chocolate cube.
Right.
So we began a process, extensive, and eventually these works were recast in more permanent materials where still chocolate, but somehow it's kind of chocolate where the sugar was removed from the mix. But I realized this is something that I was not equipped to take care of over time. And it's the one major piece from my collection that I ever sold.
Right.
I sold it to the National Gallery of Art in Washington,
Right.
where they are equipped
Let them
to take care
deal
of
with
it,
it.
and willing to take this on.
When you see a thing like Banksy, at an auction,
Yeah.
and then, they hit the gavel and
disappears.
the thing, and then it
Disintegrates,
literally
shreds.
What goes through your mind with that? Is that because what is that? It's sort of like a play on value.
Well, yeah. What is
how are you
Very successful work by Banksy.
right?
Well, just set it up though, so people understand what it is.
Okay. So it's fascinating. Maybe the most publicized, talked about work by any artist last year
Right.
was a Banksy painting that was the last lot in a Sotheby's London auction. And just as the work was being hammered down, somebody in the sales room hit a remote control switch, and the painting began descending through a shredder, and the bottom half of it ends up in fringe. The top half remains, and people go crazy and standing up, complete chaos in the sales room. And it hammered out for a high price.
Yeah.
Of course, the irony is that it's worth much more as a half-shredded painting than it would have been as the original painting.
But is that the intention? Was the intention to shred it? Is that Banksy's intention?
Well, Banksy shrouds everything in mystery.
Right.
Okay. The way I interpret this
Yes.
is the whole scenario was set up by Banksy.
Yes.
Right.
And that he orchestrated it so it would be the last lot in the sale, so it would be hung in a prominent place in the sales room rather than taken around on an easel. There may have been an insider who was in on the project
Right.
at
Right.
Sotheby's.
You have to
Maybe
get to that
not.
person.
Sotheby's claims no.
Yeah.
But it's Banksy has been very clever in understanding that, particularly today, art does not stop with the physical object.
Right.
So the way the life of the object, the way its history is communicated, the way it extends out through social media, that's part of the art.
I mean, is that a sort of Damien Hirst kind of idea? Does he begin that thought process?
Well, I think you can go way back to history. You can start with Gustave Courbet, who challenges the official salon by showing his work outside of the salon.
Right.
Right.
And who creates his own context, who creates publicity. But the intellectual structure, I would go back to Marcel Duchamp, who asserted that the artwork is not completed by the artist. The artwork is completed by the viewer
Yeah.
who
So it's
experiences it.
signing the what do you call it? The building in New York, or taking a picture of the Mona Lisa and postcard and then signing his name to
That's
it.
right.
You know.
So, well, that's an example of the artist interacting with the world.
Right.
Yeah.
And Duchamp did it in a very new, fresh way. But the meaning of the artwork and the experience of the artwork is only fully realized when the viewer engages with it and
So-
they complete it. So Banksy runs with this idea where it's not just one viewer, it's because of
Right.
social
and it-
media and all the
Yeah.
large
Right.
coverage, it's millions of people in this experience who complete the artwork.
How does Andy Warhol take that to a new modern level? Because Andy Warhol wasn't even about a painting; he was about a whole life. Did he do something unusual there?
Well, Andy Warhol is, along with Duchamp, one of the most innovative artists of the 20th century. I have a fantasy project that at one point I hope to realize.
Right.
It's a book and exhibition entitled Artist as Art.
Right.
And I'm so fascinated by artists like Marcel Duchamp, like Andy Warhol, where their whole being is an artistic statement.
When we get
And-
in, oh, sorry, no, but I was thinking we were talking about social media, and now we have a crazy change in the world where individuals think of themselves on Instagram. Everybody is, how is
Well, Andy was so prescient.
right? So
In the future, everybody will be world famous for 15 minutes.
Right.
Well, now we see it.
Now
Now
Do
we
you
see
remember
it.
the first time you met him?
Oh, yes, definitely.
I mean, was he already a great artist at that point?
Well, one of the reasons I even wanted to be involved in art and wanted to move to New York City was just somehow to get involved with Andy Warhol.
Right.
To do something with him, to just experience
So do you remember your first
So
meeting
yes,
with him?
well, it was
Must've been
just
hard to
it was
get
an
the meeting.
observation. Okay, so I was with a bunch of friends in the hot artist bar of the time. It was called the Lower Manhattan Ocean Club. It was Mickey Ruskin, who is most famous for Max's Kansas City.
Sure.
It was his latest venture. And I was at a booth with a number of young artists and John Wilcock, who was one of the original editors of Interview magazine. He wasn't really involved with Andy anymore at that time. This was 1975. And I'm sitting in the booth, and then I see this kind of apparition slowly coming down the aisle. And it was Andy Warhol. And John Wilcock kind of stands up in the booth, Andy.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget this. Andy made this gesture with his hands and with his mouth without verbalizing anything. And it really was, wow, this is an apparition. This is like a ghost.
Yeah.
And he didn't say, oh, hi, John, nice to see you. It was just this ghost-like gesture. And then he floated by.
Yeah.
So that was my first image
Yeah.
of Andy Warhol.
Do you
Just
remember-
so implanted in my mind.
Do you remember talking to him the first time?
Yeah. So then I had this scheme. So I attended the Harvard Business School, and improbably for someone
Perfect background for being an art dealer.
who had spent 2 years in the Soho art scene in the beginnings of punk rock in New York City.
Right.
But I joked with my friends that, what, you're going to Harvard Business School? And I said, well, I'm going to Harvard Business School to study art criticism.
Right.
And, but it was an exaggeration. But in fact, that experience informed my ability to write about art in a way that was much fresher and more interesting than it would have been if I had gone to the Institute of Fine Arts.
Right.
So I cooked up this concept to write my thesis at the Harvard Business School on Andy Warhol as a business artist.
Right.
So that was my platform for going to meet Andy Warhol.
Right.
So I got an appointment with the factory. Of course, I had to go through a filter. I had to go through Vincent Fremont
Right.
and Fred Hughes, Andy's managers,
Sure.
and began doing my research. And it was on one of my visits, I was in Vincent's office that Andy, who didn't have an office himself, liked to use. So Vincent says, oh, would you like to meet Andy? And Andy just floats into the office
Yeah.
because he was lighter than air. And just says, oh, hi. And, well, that was my first conversation with Andy Warhol.
And did you eventually get to a deeper...
Well, so then another scheme of mine to get more involved with Andy is I organized an exhibition of Andy Warhol's portraits,
Right.
basically celebrity portraits, for the opening of a new club in Hong Kong, the I Club. And Fred Hughes, Andy's manager, was very good at negotiating these deals. And part of the deal was that the entire Andy Warhol posse would get invited to Hong Kong. They filled the entire first-class section of a Pan Am Clipper.
Right. Were you
And-
on the plane too?
No, I was already there.
Right.
There's a wonderful photograph of me greeting Andy as he arrives at the Mandarin Hotel in Hong Kong.
Right.
And,
What did he say to you as he was pulling up?
well, so I had numerous conversations with Andy by then, but I only heard him speaking in monosyllables.
Right.
Famously, wow, gee.
Sure.
I never really, I thought that's all that Andy said.
Yeah.
And then we have the whole entourage around this big Chinese Lazy Susan table for dinner at the I Club. They had a lot of energy even after this long trip. And it was just me and the owner of the I Club,
Yeah.
and then Andy and all his friends. And we were just there in the middle of this conversation, and I was just amazed to hear Andy talking, but not just talking. Andy was one of the greatest raconteurs of his time.
Sure.
And
So
and I was, and somehow after that I was just admitted into the circle.
So it was facade. You're not going to get through this facade. I'm not going to tell you a thing about me. And then eventually you hung around long enough that you got inside.
Right. I think that this was just his method of dealing with all the hangers-on of all the people who wanted something from him.
Yeah.
So at a public situation, he would just respond in monosyllables.
Right.
So he didn't have to engage in conversations with hundreds of people a day.
What did you learn at the factory? What did you see? I mean, did you see Lou Reed
I
and
learned
all these
so much.
people?
Well, by the time I was involved, this was the early 80s.
Right.
Okay, so the days of the real factory were long gone.
Right.
It was really Andy Warhol Enterprises by that time.
Right.
It was, many ways, a kind of pseudo-business.
Right.
A business of portrait commissions and corporate commissions and Interview magazine.
Yeah.
And he wasn't even making films anymore.
Right.
But I say it was like a mock business.
Right.
Because it was really about art. And it was, if it was business art.
Did you, I know him a little bit, just a little bit, but did you find him to be, the root
you
of
knew
that
him a
power?
little bit?
I
You
knew
knew him a little bit.
Andy Warhol
Got
a
it.
little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
Because I kind of,
Yeah.
my dad, it's like, sort of traveled in the same small circle.
Right. An apparition.
But to make art like that, to live like that, there has to be vulnerability somewhere.
Oh, Andy was very vulnerable.
And it's never shown to the public. We think of him just as like he just whipped these things up. But did you see the vulnerability? in
Oh,
him?
absolutely. So when we presented the project in Hong Kong, we had a number of social events around it, and we organized a very high-profile press event where all the journalists covering culture, art, and Hong Kong and Southeast Asia came and started asking him questions. And it's going very well. People are very respectful. And then toward the end of the press conference, some young man asked a question about Edie Sedgwick. Now, just at that time, this is when the book by Gene Stein about Edie Sedgwick has come out. And it's a big cultural moment. And the book unfairly paints Andy as someone who is maybe partially responsible for Edie Sedgwick's decline and eventual death. And so this young man asks a question, very inappropriate, of, well, what do you think about the book, and do you feel that you're somewhat responsible for Edie Sedgwick's death? And Andy, who we know had the most pale complexion you've ever experienced, when all remaining color drains out of his skin, and he is just in shock. And I can see, the horror going through his face.
Yeah.
That here, on the other side of the world, he couldn't escape that bad rap about Edie Sedgwick. And I observed Andy, and he was such a kind person, such a generous person. And to blame somebody's own personal problems on Andy Warhol, it's so unfair.
Do you remember meeting Jean-Michel Basquiat?
Oh, well, very well. I was good friends with Jean-Michel.
Did you meet him when he was just doing the cards? So was it pre him becoming a phenomenon, or was he already a known artist?
Well, he was a phenomenon from like the age of 17, 18 years old.
Right.
Okay, so before meeting Jean-Michel himself, I lived downtown New York, and like everyone, I was so intrigued by this conceptual haiku of the Samo graffiti.
Right.
It's really concrete poetry. There's nothing like it.
Right.
And so we're all of us asking, who's Samo? I didn't realize then the pronunciation was correct pronunciation was Samo.
Right.
Or like same old.
Right.
We mistakenly thought it was Samo.
Right.
But it wasn't. And he was even though he was very much around, people didn't quite know who did it, didn't connect him with a person.
Right.
It was actually Jean-Michel and one or two other friends of his
Right.
from Cydia's school. So my first actual encounter with Jean-Michel the person was when I went to a performance of his noise band Gray.
Right.
And a friend of mine points him out. He was playing a kind of noise box.
Right.
And said, that's Samo.
Yeah.
Really, that's him. Very charismatic person, very, very good looking, very stylish.
But did you understand the magnitude of his contribution at that early stage?
People really knew that he was something.
Right.
Very early on.
And
Then I turned out to be the first person to actually write about Jean-Michel Basquiat as artist rather than Samo.
right.
There was a story in the Village Voice about Samo. The Times Square show, the summer of 1980, my favorite room in the Times Square show, where 100+ young artists got together to create their own show in an abandoned massage parlor
Right.
in Times Square. My favorite room was the fashion room,
Right.
where Jean-Michel had painted the walls, and then a number of friends of his had their own fashion works and other things in the room. And I wrote a review of the Times Square show for Art in America,
Right.
and in it was the first mention of Jean-Michel as an artist.
Now you watched him over the years, and you watched him develop into a giant artist. What was that? Because that's really, you're there at the beginning
Right,
stage,
right.
and
But
what's it like to see that all?
Well, but
happen?
what I'm emphasizing is that even before he made his now iconic paintings, people on the scene knew this was the guy. This was a giant talent, even starting with the Samo graffiti, and then that wall work that he did that I described as a knockout combination of de Kooning and Subway spray paint.
Mm-hmm.
That was, for me, the strongest work in the whole Times Square show.
No.
So people knew, and it was not a surprise to see him mature and do these masterful paintings, because the talent was evident from the beginning. And he had earned already the respect of the whole downtown scene.
Did you see that with Keith Haring as well? Like, was it the similar sort of situation that everybody just knew?
So I met Keith Haring when I went to a party at Tony Shafrazi's apartment on Lexington Avenue. This is before Tony Shafrazi had his gallery. And he had hired Keith Haring as his bartender. But he had no idea then who Keith was, that Keith was going to become his greatest star artist.
Right.
And Keith, at that time, he was offering his artist friends exhibitions on his eyeglass frames.
Right.
And I see Keith behind the bar with these painted eyeglasses, and I start talking to him, wow, tell me, but those are amazing. And he explained what he was doing,
Right.
that he was offering shows. And that was the beginning of my friendship with Keith Haring. It started with that conversation. And so Keith was always, from the very beginning, he was still a student at the School of Visual Arts then, he was always a charismatic presence And other artists understood that he was an artistic leader. They gathered around him.
So you, as this community that you were a part of for a long time, to now, do you see it as a continuum, and that we have Keith Haring's now, and we have Basquiat's now, and we have, is your job, you're the steward of this? How do you see your role?
Okay, well, see, I see art as an ongoing discourse.
Right.
Where artists like Keith Haring, they're somehow in conversation
Still.
with Picasso
Right.
and artists before them. Keith was very interested, very influenced by Alashinsky. I
Right.
saw an exhibition of his at the Carnegie when he was a student still living in Pennsylvania. And artists, so they're in conversation with artists from the past, with artists around them, the present, and someone like Keith is also sending out inspiration for the future.
Right.
So I love being part of this discourse.
Right.
Because, again, artists don't just make an object. They're in this network of influences from the past and the present.
So,
And in terms of my role, well, at the beginning, I just wanted to participate.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't matter whether I was going to write about it, do business, deal in the art, curate it, actually make art, which I did at one point. I just wanted to participate, and I'm very grateful that I'm still participating. And what I try to do now, because I have a little seniority, is to try to use my experience, try to articulate trends and patterns. So
What do you see now? Like when you see, we talked about social media a little bit. I do want to get back
or
to
just
that.
are the tools changing?
Yeah.
Yes,
Or
yes.
something like Instagram. We talked a little bit about it the last time we
Yes,
saw you.
yes. Okay, so this is a very interesting period in visual arts. And just as you have a whole new structure with filmmaking, with the streamers and people watching film on their phones. So I've been following how visual arts is changing in response to this new situation. Well, first, just to back up a little bit, okay, so I mentioned like a lot of people my age in New York City, that I was enthralled by what was happening with punk rock and new wave rock and no wave rock, and I followed it. I would go to CBGBs almost every night, and other clubs, eventually Mud Club and Area. So I was very immersed in all this. And I was also, when I was a teenager, a big rock and roll fan. And I always wondered, well, what's wrong? Why is it that the appreciation, the audience for visual art is so narrow compared with the audience for music? And why couldn't visual art appeal to millions of young people and connect with them the way music did? What was wrong? What wasn't happening? Now, it's fascinating to see how visual art is being able to communicate in such a broader way now. And so the current generation is probably the most visually fluent generation in history, where people are so aware of images, they know images, and they create their own images. And so how is this affecting visual art? Well, in one way, it's Instagram and other ways of distributing images is now kind of trumping art form reviews and the New York Times art critics.
Yeah.
So artists and the art audience get so much of their information through social media. And I'm so interested in how this elaborate endorsement system that used to control the channeling of art history. So distinguished critics,
Right.
people like Clement Greenberg in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, Lucy Lepard in the 60s, 70s, how this elaborate endorsement system that the artists, the dealers, the museums, collectors all bought into, how it's being usurped by, say, somebody like Pharrell, tweeting an interest in an artist or putting something on his Instagram, or that somebody with 1 million plus Instagram followers can be more influential now than the distinguished critic of the New York Times. And so this is all just beginning.
Right.
But I'm fascinated to see it unfold.
But without judgment, right? I mean, in the end, is there judgment here on your part? Because is it
so
crowdsourcing?
let's just take some of our favorite musicians of the 1960s. Okay. Was their influence there because somebody in an influential newspaper wrote a good review?
Right.
No, I think it was the audience
Yeah.
that spoke.
Right.
Yeah.
It was the audience who attended the concerts, who bought
Right.
the records.
Right.
The way that we get music has changed. And, you think about Miles Davis. Miles Davis had jazz fans, and it had people, a whole machinery that moved around Miles Davis that doesn't really exist anymore for jazz. Is this change that you're talking about, is it more democratizing? Does it have a contribution to make? Does it change the way we view art?
Well, so it's so fascinating to think about this, because there's the whole issue of, well, what are the standards?
Yeah.
What about
Right.
quality?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's this phenomenon that a lot of people in the art world are talking about with an artist who I admire, who I consider a friend, Kaws, Kaws. So Kaws comes from a different trajectory than most of the established artists. Starts working on the street, doing these fascinating things of replacing the ads in bus shelters with his interventions, then putting them back, and,
Right.
and having a shop in Tokyo with his toys. So he builds his following through a constituency of people who follow streetwear, sneakerheads,
Right.
skate subculture. He wasn't, for years, he wasn't let in to the art establishment. So this year, the art world is astonished to see, kind of out of nowhere, Kaws selling for his $3.5 million at an
Right.
auction. And then more recently, $15 million at an auction. And wow, who is this? And then people realize that Kaws, who they haven't been paying attention to, is conceivably the most popular artist out there today.
Right.
And
right.
and so this constituency of Pharrell, who I
Yeah.
mentioned,
Yeah.
and others who
Yeah.
are in this mix of music, streetwear,
right.
skate culture,
Right.
they have so much power.
But,
so the art world is caught off guard. How did this happen?
Yeah.
But people are looking and say, wow, this work is pretty good. Yeah. And so right now he's in a transition where actually museum shows are happening.
Right.
He's
Right.
going to have a retrospective at the Brooklyn Museum. So,
But,
just like the greatest musicians, they're simultaneously super popular, but also esteemed for the quality of their work.
But it's interesting because you said, well, why, kids will listen to music, why aren't they going out to watch art? Now you have a situation where these influencers are saying, look at this. So in a way, what may be toppling the art world as we know it, the old way of doing it, is still getting lots of people to look and pay attention, to maybe come into this world. So maybe there's some great thing about that, because more people are saying, what do I see? How do I see the world? It's interesting that how these influencers, and by the way, who else is out there? So it's kind of self-organizing. So in fact, maybe we do want to see things. It's just what happens when you put them into a museum? Does that become that thing again, that barrier? We had once talked to Baldessari about that idea of the conceptual art. You know very well about Baldessari, but are people, once a person goes into a museum or is sanctioned by a group of people, does that make it such that the masses say, let's move on? What happens to this person when they become so famous and so expensive? Does it deplete, or not the right word, but take away from?
Oh, I think we're seeing the development of the new model. We don't quite know the answer how this is happening. What I think about is we followed how some big stars in music haven't come through the system. They haven't come through record labels, art critics. They just posted something on YouTube.
Billie Eilish came out there.
And it just builds.
Yeah.
So I anticipate that we're going to see visual artists emerge in this way. So no platform of support, somebody who starts by putting out images and builds a following, and then a larger following, and then influencers get involved. So I'm very interested to see this challenge of this elaborate art world endorsement system that so many of us in the field are part of.
Right.
Things have changed, but is there still a place for Picasso and Andy and Basquiat and Keith Haring and all the other people who've contributed in this long tradition of beautiful art? Do they still have a place in this modern world?
Oh, more than ever, because people are more visually fluent than ever, and so many people have access to these images.
Yeah,
they're looking them up. They know the images. They know the vocabulary. So we're talking about how talented people can reach the public by leapfrogging this stultified system.
right.
Okay? But ultimately, quality, the work, is what matters. Mm-hmm. And work that's superficial may get a little bit of attention, but it can't be sustained. The image has to be strong, and there's something that is essential about all the art that lasts. It's not just retinal, as Duchamp would say. It has an intellectual structure beneath it. And if the art does not have this intellectual structure, it slowly just dissipates into the cloud of all the images in our world.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Really appreciate you coming here and doing this. It's great.
Thank you. And
Good.
I was just
Well,
thinking
always
about
very
the
stimulating
beekeeping
conversations.
The
Thank you.
beekeeping cave image still lasts, right?
Yeah.
That was a long time ago.
Yeah. Thanks for watching or listening. Don't forget to subscribe. Click here for the next episode.
Here.